Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate here. I'll speak into this. Thank you. I'm very feel privileged to be invited to participate in the symposium and to do my bit to add to the event, which is honouring Margaret MacDonald. Her website is absolutely awesome, and it's an exciting moment to see that up and running. So my title today is Subject and Object in Whistler, the Context of Physiological Aesthetics. Just move that a bit. In Harmony in Grey and Green, Miss Cicely Alexander, we see the solemn and, according to one reviewer, bilious pose of the young 8-year-old sitter. Whistler's mother recounted how cold and rainy the season was and how miserably dark the days were. Cicely posed for hours at a time. Meantime, her lunch was being kept warm in the plate warmer by the fire. Her own mother quietly passed the time crocheting, and Anna Whistler spoke in November 1872 of what a relief it would be for the sittings to come to an end, so that the Alexanders didn't have to make the twice-weekly journey to Cheyne Walk on these short, dark days. The gloomy days affected Anna Whistler's eyesight. She struggled to keep up her letter writing, telling one correspondent, "Darkness through incessant rains makes it difficult for my sight." Cicely herself tells of the strain of posing and her relief when the blessed black fog came up from the river, invading the studio and making it impossible for Whistler to continue with his work. My topic today includes that cold London fog hanging over the river, shrouding the forms of the city, spilling into places of habitation, and occluding the artist's vision. Fog will help me to argue that Whistler was aligned with the physiological aestheticists in his approach to aesthetic experience, concerned with reciprocal object-subject issues in terms set out by physiological psychologists of the 1870s, primitivist in his evocation of fundamental aspects of perception and being, concerned with the correlative relationship of extension in time and extension in space as grounds of being and experience, and as a consequence, it can be argued that his works were concerned with duration as much as instantaneity and spatiality rather than flatness. Both findings might be seen to offer an alternative perspective to the more familiar modernist emphasis on evanescence and flatness in Whistler's art. I'll propose that Whistler's Nocturne should be understood in the context of experiments on threshold perception, exploring a state dubbed hyperesthesis by the physiological aestheticists. In addition, I'll be arguing that in his visual art, Whistler was concerned with more than the optical. He was concerned with the sensorium. The visual effects of Whistler's Thames views of the 1870s, his Nocturne, where detail is lost in murky half-light, were associated with London fog, whether or not he explicitly depicted fog. The Illustrated Review, as early as 1873, urged Whistler to move on from the topic, to realize that there was more to nature than a grey fog on the Thames. The Magazine of Art in 1878 identified Whistler's cityscapes in the Grosvenor Gallery exhibition as 3 clever renderings of various effects of London fog, including a floating bank of smoke over the river, but went on to object that London's polluted atmosphere was not the place to find beauty and the desirable tone of nature. In smoke and in London fog, all that could be found was the poor and grimy darkness of soot. The phenomenon of fog was much discussed. The chill water of the Thames and certain anticyclonic conditions routinely produced a layer of fog over the river as daylight faded. This layer did occasionally mass up, rising to street level or above, producing a major meteorological event. The graphic in 1872 classifies various kinds of fog, illustrating the severe street-level type. The fogs of the city smelt of coal smoke, sludge, and sulphur, tasted foul, brought on coughs and asthmatic attacks, and made the eyes sting due to gases and vapors produced by the combustion of fuel, whence the atmosphere is charged with carbon, sulfurous nitrous, and paraligneous acids, as one scientific commentary has it. The fires of industrial establishments and homes poured particles of tar and carbon into the atmosphere. They infiltrated the cloud and coated the droplets of water, creating a peculiar fog, yellow in color or else black and oily when touched. When the subject of a photographic portrait was obscured by fog hanging in the studio, then the requisite portrait simply could not be made. On the other hand, Fun magazine slyly suggested that some clients would be better photographed in a fog. The same might be said for the industrial jumble of the Battersea shoreline, which Whistler beautified by rendering it repeatedly in the restricted light of evening, the indistinct forms evoking the effect of mist or fog on the Thames. Thomas Arscott, who was to take on the role of editor of the Fortnightly Review, saw Whistler's Nocturne in 1879 as taking advantage of the aesthetic and aestheticizing aspect of fog. It cannot be denied that they have a copious measure of suggestive poetry, the dim gleam of lamps like gold and red stars through mist, idealizing the effect of a London river fog. Surely this is poetry, such poetry as any of us can see any day if we look for it. This was the implication of, just going to go back for a second, back that way. The implication of the Athenaeum reviewer in 1876, who commented on the naturalistic underpinnings of Whistler's moonlight and fog studies, seeing the two works at the Deschamps Gallery in that year as not just studies in colour and tone of subtle quality, not just art for art's sake, but as loyal representations of nature, nature seen afresh in the selection of unusual effects rather than conventionally rendered. I'll be coming back to this comment in the Athenaeum on art for art's sake versus nature. London fogs were notorious for their nastiness and for the beauty that was produced. An extreme case, such as that of December 1879, saw the papers describing the yellow gloom, where visibility was reduced to 3 yards on the Strand and locomotion slowed to a creeping pace. On this occasion, the Daily News allowed that, with the flare of torches and lanterns and the glimmer of gas lamps showing up in the thick darkness, there was an aesthetic effect. Viewed merely as a fog, this latest fog, it said, was artistically perfect. It's been understood that the Nocturne, for all their exquisite compositions of tone and colour, never fully relinquish the description of actual locale. The paradox of these two aspects of the artworks has exercised art historians, many of whom have rightly emphasized the geographical specifics, whether of Battersea, Cremorne, Chelsea, or Westminster, that persist in Whistler's formalized rendition. John Seward, who is going to be speaking next, for instance, summed up the balance maintained by Whistler between the description of an encounter with a geographically specific nocturnal landscape and the dissipation or dissolution of the locale in pure colour and form. If we return to those comments in the Athenaeum, considering the representation of nature versus art for art's sake, we find that the reviewer uses the term objective for the vast majority of naturalistic art, in the quotation, representing with certain necessary conventions of the art the subjects chosen by the painters as they refer to nature in a more or less exact or comprehensive way, reserving the term subjective for art for art's sake, for its unanchored use of colour, tone, and shape, where the exigencies of the composition determine the elements. So when a motif was deemed ugly and incompetently drawn, as Whistler's Harmony in Yellow and Gold, portrait of Miss Connie Gilchrist, reviewed in the Athenaeum in 1879, these demerits were stated to belong to its objective character. However, in the very same picture, the colour harmony could be beautiful, a beautiful illustration of certain principles of chromatic art, of which Mr. Whistler is still the leading prophet. Drawing and the referent belong to the objective, while colour and abstract values belong to the subjective. The reviewer had recourse to terms familiar from the context of philosophy and the field of philosophical psychology that was particularly strong in Britain in the 1870s. In the case of the moonlight and fog studies, he finds that Whistler's art that seems subjective should by rights be acknowledged as objective by virtue of their fidelity to elements of natural light and weather conditions, not routinely approached by other artists. In the case of Harmony in Yellow and Gold that we see here, he finds that the work, like the title, has two aspects. It's subjective and objective. The way in which he puts Whistler's art on a junction between these two terms is significant in terms of the way that the terms were being negotiated by philosophically inclined anti-idealist psychologists of the 1870s. The Fortnightly Review was an important vehicle for cultural avant-gardism in the late 1860s and 70s, as well as advanced scientific thinking. In that journal, in the 1870s, detailed assessment of the empiricist dispute with Kant's account of subject and object, and key texts for physiological aesthetics, such as James Sully's essays on sensation and musical form, sat alongside reviews by Sidney Colvin, poems by Swinburne and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and reviews of London art exhibitions. The visibility of physiological aesthetics in the cultural nexus inhabited by Whistler can be easily established, even if we do not have evidence of Whistler's own reading in this area. The journals give us evidence that scientific and philosophical issues were not sectioned off from other cultural debates. Other broad interest journals were also important for physiological aesthetics: the Westminster Review, Contemporary Review, and Mind. If nothing else, we can be certain that Whistler accessed the journals and read the art reviews vigilantly, looking for slights in his paranoid manner. A general shift in psychology took place from mid-century, with a strong current emerging of physiologically based investigation which challenged metaphysical assumptions about the mind, above all, challenging the idea that the mind and body were separate entities. The focus of physiological psychology was on the bodily nervous system and the organism as a processor of sensory stimuli. This was a study of the mind that focused on embodiment and corporeal reception and information from the environment. It traced back the processing ability of the human mind to the reactions observable in all life forms, even the most primitive, and owed much to the impact of Herbert Spencer and Darwin. Biological entities, it was argued, have the urge for self-conservation, so there is movement in response to the stimulus, protrusion in response to the beneficial stimulus, or aversion from the injurious. Sensibility is taken to be a vital property of tissue from the plant up. One example given is the reflex closure of a leaf when the hairs of a sensitive plant are touched, or the sensitivity of the human eye. This sensibility is traced back to the common denominator of a cell structure and a ground substance of protoplasm with vital qualities in both plant and animal. Physiological psychologists were particularly interested in the mental phenomena occurring that could be classed as perception or ideation, and neural process undergone as stimulus led on to perception. This could be conceived of in organisms where there was a degree of coordination and a centralized neural structure. George Henry Lewis suggests that even mollusks might be credited with subjectivity in these terms. James Sully reported on optical experiments on the persistence of the image, where a viewer saw grey instead of rapidly alternating black and white that was actually being shown. The viewer's tendency to see grey was tested in different light conditions: daylight, candlelight, and moonlight. The time span of the alternation necessary for grey to be perceived was found to vary. By moonlight, the alternation could be much slower. The after impression of black or white lasted much longer. The explanation for this was couched in terms of the exhaustion of the nerve under more intense light and lesser exhaustion in limited light. Anesthesia of the nerves could occur in bright light conditions, and as a corollary, hyperaesthesia could be observed in cases of understimulation, for instance, in low light, the nerve fibers becoming highly excitable under those conditions. The ability to discriminate between sensations was studied, and the threshold of perception of a sound, a light, or a pinprick was carefully quantified. The physiological psychologists lent on these kind of empiricist investigations to show that fundamental organic responsiveness and properties of the nerve fibers underlay all perception. Subjectivity was defined in these discussions as the coordination of the various body parts through the grey matter in the brain, spinal column, and ganglionic centers alike throughout the nervous system. Equally, the coordination of the five senses, it was claimed, always attended perception. In other words, the coordinated sensorium was said to be necessary for perception. Instances of optical or auditory hallucination, synesthetic perception, and memory were referenced to show that perception requires the coordination offered by the sensorium. Subjectivity was crucial in these arguments, but the case was strongly made that subjectivity did not relate to the brain, relegating objectivity to the body, nor were will and advanced intellect essential to subjectivity. Instead, the organism objectively received stimuli from the environment and subjectively had psychic experience in perceiving the stimuli. Each was the flip side of the other. The subject gave on to the object brought the subject into being. Aesthetic response was argued to be at base a matter of, as Sully put it, regarding timbre and harmony in music, and here I quote, the favorable mode of nervous stimulation. So pleasure in discrete tones came from the even regularity of a sequent molecular movement of a nervous fiber in the ear. Beyond this substratum of sensuous gratification, aesthetic pleasure could be complexified as musical elements were combined and the mind's ability to assess resemblance came into play and higher intellectual faculties were engaged. Psychologists differed in the way they apportioned automatic and conscious or reasoned responses. Now, Henry James, in an essay of 1888, wrote about the London atmosphere, registering it as the beautiful and unescapable condition of life in the metropolis. He wrote about the magnificent, thick medium of the sky, where the smoke and fog and the weather in general, the strangely undefined hour of the day and season of the year, the emanations of industries and the reflections of furnaces hang together. Friendly with Whistler by this date, it's likely that he had in mind Whistler's works, as he wrote various passages in this essay on London and an earlier one of 1877 on the squalor of the waterfront looking over from Chelsea and the peculiarity of atmosphere with its magnificent mystifications, which flatters and superfuses, makes everything brown, rich, dim, vague, magnifies distances and minimizes details, confirms the inference of vastness by suggesting that as the great city makes everything, it makes its own system of weather. Henry James, his inference of vastness here can be read in parallel with the investigation of spatiality by the physiological psychologists, notably his own brother, William James, in the late 1870s and early 1880s. William James was an important young psychologist emerging to notice in the late 1870s, and he went even further than Sully in refuting a dualism between the mind and the body. And I show you the title page here from one of his summary publications on psychology from late in the century. Moving on from the investigation of the specific physiological aspects of the 5 separate senses, the coordination of senses, that crucial ground of subjectivity, was approached by studies on time and space. The sensorium embraced all discrete sense impressions, touch, taste, smell, sound, and sight, and had to be understood in terms of the double parameters of time and space. Lewis commented on the need to see each discrete instantaneous reaction in something broader temporally, understood as experience. The psychological aspect of time and space were respectively memory and the sense of spatiality. Whistler's own memory procedures in making his nocturne, the slowing down of visual perception in low light conditions, the issues of persistence of visual impression, we can think about sparks, actually or apparently hanging in the sky. All these are relevant to a psychophysiological account of experience. We can think of Whistler's selected subjects as experimental setups to investigate subjective experience at its limit points. In fog-bound London, where life slowed down to crawling pace, stimuli impinged on the subject in clammy skin, prickling eyes, tarry taste, sulphurous smell, muffled sounds, and optical phenomenon of proximate coloured clouds, offering a kind of sensory deprivation that gave way to multi-sensory hyperesthesia. As a final suggestion, I want to attend to spatiality as the essential correlate of memory or temporality. In the writing of George Henry Lewis, the suggestion is made that time, in terms of memory, habit, culture, experience, is proper to the psyche, while space, in terms of bodily volume, environmental extensiveness, is proper to the body. But of course, his underlying argument was for continuity between mind and body, for interchangeability between subject and object. Memory guides the psyche into certain defined pathways, narrowing and selection result. The extensiveness of the body and its existence in space, on the other hand, allows for what Lewis calls the irradiation of stimuli from one particular sense organ into the sensorium. Expansion and inclusiveness result. William James, in his essay of 1879, The Spatial Quale, asserts that there is a basic sensory apprehension of space that predates ideas of measurement, local differentiation, and relative distances. And I quote, "In the individual's psychic history, the sensation, space as a simple vague consciousness of vastness, comes first. All the senses are capable of registering space directly, according to James. Staring into an empty blue sky, the eye conveys its spaciousness. This capability is linked to the subject's apprehension of his or her own bodily extensiveness. He gives the example of a fetus bathed in amniotic fluid, and I quote, feeling its total vastness without discerning positions therein. Apprehension of spatiality is being proposed, therefore, by James as a primordial supersense, primal both in terms of the individual's development and the evolutionary development of organic life. The foggy or gloomy unification of the pictorial composition achieved by Whistler, almost devoid of points of measurement and differentiation, references, I suggest, a spatial quale, which gives onto its object the extensiveness of London and its subject, the sensate being. This being is capable of sensory gratification and therefore aesthetic experience through the favorable excitation of the nervous system. The arguments emerging in physiological psychology in the 1870s make it important that we attend to these intimations of environmental and bodily space alongside the issues of temporality in Whistler's art. Thank you.